Father, I pray that you help us to dissect this surgically and methodically and help us to just live another day peacefully. Amen. It's going to go Marx, Trotsky, Mao, and then Hitler, I believe. So, at Marx's funeral in Highgate Cemetery, Engels declared that Marx had made two great discoveries: the law of development of human history and the law of motion of bourgeois society. Bourgeois means the middle class. But Marx was before all else a revolutionist. He was the best hated and most calumniated man of his time, yet he also died beloved, revered, and mourned by millions of revolutionary fellow workers. The contradictory emotions Marx engendered are reflected in the sometimes conflicting aspects of his character. Marx was a combination of the Promethean rebel and the rigorous intellectual, which means of or relating to the intellect or its use. He gave most persons an impression of intellectual arrogance. A Russian writer, Pavel Ananikov, who observed Marx in debate in 1846, recalled that he spoke only in the imperative, not to be avoided or evaded, necessary, brooking no contradiction, and seemed to be the personification of a democratic dictator, such as might appear before one in moments of fantasy. But Marx obviously felt uneasy before mass audiences and avoided the atmosphere of factional controversies at congresses. He went to no demonstrations, his wife remarked, and rarely spoke at public meetings. He kept away from the congresses of the International, where the rival socialist groups debated important resolutions. He was a small groups man, most at home in the atmosphere of the general council or on the staff of a newspaper, where his character could impress itself forcefully on a small body of co-workers. At the same time, he avoided meeting distinguished scholars with whom he might have discussed questions of economics and sociology on a footing of intellectual equality. Despite his broad intellectual sweep, he was prey to obsessive ideas such as that the British Foreign Minister, Lord Palmerston, was an agent of the Russian government. He was determined not to let bourgeois society make a money-making machine out of him, yet he submitted to living on the largesse of Engels and the bequest of relatives. And I think that would be giving or leaving something by will, bequeathing. He remained the eternal student in his personal habits and way of life, even to the point of joining two friends in a student's prank, during which they systematically broke 4 or 5 street lamps in a London street and then fled from the police. He was a great reader of novels, especially those of Sir Walter Scott and Balzac, and the family made a cult of Shakespeare. He was an affectionate father, saying that he admired Jesus for his love of children, but sacrificed the lives and health of his own. Of his 7 children, 3 daughters grew to maturity. His favorite daughter, Eleanor, worried him with her nervous, brooding, and emotional character and her desire to be an actress. Another shadow was cast on Marx's domestic life by the birth to their loyal servant, Helena de Muth, of an illegitimate son, Frederick. Engels, as he was dying, disclosed to Eleanor that Marx had been the father. Above all, Marx was a fighter, willing to sacrifice any in the battle for his conception of a better society. He regarded struggle as the law of life and existence. As these monsters, I don't think they start out as monsters. There's some stuff in there that we'd all agree with, but I'm not that I'm sure. The influence of Marx's ideas has been enormous. Marx's masterpiece, Das Kapital, the Bible of the working class, as was officially described in a resolution of the International Workingmen's Association, was published in 1867 in Berlin and reads a second edition in 1873. Only the first volume was completed and published in Marx's lifetime. The second and third volumes, unfinished by Marx, were edited by Engels and published in 1885 and 1894. The economic categories he employed were those of the classical British economics of David Ricardo, but Marx used them in accordance with his dialectical method to argue that bourgeois society, like every social organism, must follow its inevitable path of development. Through the working of such imminent tendencies as a declining rate of profit, capitalism would die and be replaced by another higher society. See, the most memorable pages in Das Kapital are the descriptive passages culled from parliamentary blue books on the misery of the English working class. Marx believed that this misery would increase, while at the same time the monopoly of capital would become a fetter upon production until finally the knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated. Marx never claimed to have discovered the existence of classes and class struggles in modern society. Bourgeois historians, he acknowledged, had described them long before he had. He did claim, however, to have proved that each phase in the development of production was associated with a corresponding class structure, and that the struggle of classes led necessarily to the dictatorship of the proletariat. I think proletariat is like the laborers. Ruled by the proletariat, the economic and social class, consisting of industrial workers who derive income solely from their labor. So I guess that's the peon workers, perhaps. It always does this. Oh, where are we at? It doesn't go back to where it was. I may have to. Here. What in the world? Alright, well, Karl Marx was born in the German Rhineland. I believe, to middle-class parents of Jewish descent who had abandoned their religion in an attempt to assimilate into an anti-Semitic society. The young Marx studied philosophy at the University of Berlin and received a doctorate from the University of Jena in 1841, but he was unable, because of his Jewish ancestry and his liberal political views, to secure a teaching position. He then turned to journalism, where his investigations disclosed what he perceived as systematic injustice and corruption at all levels of German society. Convinced that German, and more broadly European society, could not be reformed from within, but instead had to be remade from the ground up. Marx became a political radical. His views soon brought him to the attention of the police, and fearing arrest and imprisonment, he left for Paris. There he renewed an acquaintance with his countryman Friedrich Engels, who became his friend and co-author in a collaboration that was to last nearly 40 years. I believe Engels is the father of the Hegelian dialectic. Well, we'll click on it. Hopefully it'll bring me back to that one. I apologize. He was also from the Rhine. He was a German socialist philosopher. He's the foundation of modern communism, and Engels edited the second and third volumes of Das Kapital. He has a steadfast loyalty to Prussia and a pronounced Protestant faith. See, a lot of these people, they come from humble beginnings. I believe he's part of the Hegelian dialectic, but it would be all day, so. Okay. The son of the co-owner of a textile firm with factories in Germany and Britain, Engels was himself a capitalist who helped to manage the firm's factory in Manchester. Like Marx, Engels was deeply disturbed by what he regarded as the injustices of a society divided by class. Appalled by the poverty and squalor in which ordinary workers lived and worked, he described their misery in grisly detail in the condition of the English working class. Marx and Engels maintained that the poverty, disease, and early death that afflicted the proletariat, the industrial working class, were endemic to capitalism. There were systemic and structural problems that could be resolved only by replacing capitalism with communism. That makes sense, huh? Under this alternative system, the major means of industrial production, mines, mills, factories, and railroads, would be publicly owned and operated for the benefit of all. Marx and Engels presented this critique of capitalism in a brief sketch of a possible future communist society and manifesto of the Communist Party. Marx, meanwhile, had begun to lay the theoretical and scientific foundations of communism, first in the German ideology, and later in Das Kapital. His theory has three main aspects, and I think this is what I was looking for, but these three main aspects really caught my attention, so maybe you can look at it and through your lens. But a materialist conception of history. I'll say again, a materialist conception of history. Second, a critique of capitalism and its inner workings. A third, an account of the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism and its eventual replacement by communism. Marx's materialist theory history is a series of class struggles and revolutionary upheavals, leading ultimately to freedom for all. And you notice that it says upheavals. That's what do you call it? Plural. Marx derived his views in part from the philosophy of G.W.F. Hegel, who conceived of history as a dialectical. So I was wrong. Excuse me, I was wrong. It was this G.W.F. Hegel who conceived of history as a dialectical self-development of spirit. In contrast to Hegel's philosophical idealism, however, Marx held that history is driven by the material or economic conditions that prevail in a given age. Before men can do anything else, Marx wrote, they must first produce the means of their subsistence. Without material production, there would be no life and thus no human activity. According to Marx, material production requires two things: material forces of production, roughly, raw materials and the tools required to extract and process them, and social relations of production, the division of labor through which raw materials are extracted and processed. Human history is a story of both elements changing and becoming even more complex. In primitive societies, the material forces were few and simple. For example, grains and the stone used to grind them into flour. With the growth of knowledge and technology came successive upheavals or revolutions, and the forces and relations of production and the complexity of invention of the steam shovel changed the way they extracted iron ore. Since no miner could afford to buy a steam shovel, he had to work for someone who could. Industrial capitalism, in Marx's view, is an economic system in which one class, the ruling bourgeois, owns the means of production while the working class or proletariat effectively loses its independence, the worker becoming part of the means of production, a mere appendage of the machine. So the second aspect is his critique of capitalism. Marx held that human history had progressed through a series of stages, from ancient slave society through feudalism. Now let's look at what feudalism is. Oh, it's going to take me back. Historical construct designating the social, economic, and political conditions in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. The long stretch of time between the 5th and 12th centuries, feudalism and the related term feudal system are labels invented long after the period to which they were applied. They refer to what those who invented them perceived as the most significant and distinctive characteristics. Well, I think it's more of like it's really important to define that. Let me bookmark this, and we'll define feudalism. Was a combination of various customs and systems that flourished in medieval Europe. Broadly defined, it is a way of structuring society around relationships, divided from the holding of land in exchange for service or labor. So there's a lot of that going on today, I believe. But man, it's just not going. Okay. In each stage, a dominant class uses its control of the means of production to exploit the labor of a larger class of workers, but internal tensions or contradictions in each stage eventually lead to the overthrow and replacement of the ruling class by a successor. Thus, the bourgeois overthrow the aristocracy, and I believe that's like the nobles, or like a small privileged class. Okay. Aristocracy means the rule of the few, the morally and intellectually superior. Okay, so that seems to be, we know what is the truth anymore, but that, I've been really thinking about this and wanted to just be honest with it and replace feudalism with capitalism. So Marx predicted, will the proletariat overthrow the bourgeois and replace capitalism with communism? Marx acknowledged that capitalism was a historically necessary stage of development that had brought about remarkable scientific and technological changes. Changes that greatly increased aggregate wealth by extending humankind's power over nature. The problem, Marx believed, was that this wealth and the political power and economic opportunities that went with it was unfairly distributed. The capitalists reaped the profits while paying the workers a pittance for long hours of hard labor, yet it is the workers who create economic value, according to Marx's labor theory of value, which holds that the worth of a commodity is determined by the amount of labor required to produce it. Under capitalism, Marx claimed workers are not paid fully or fairly for their labor because the capitalists siphon off surplus value, which they call profit. Thus, the bourgeois owners of the means of production amass enormous wealth, while the proletariat falls further into poverty. This wealth also enables the bourgeois to control the government or state, which does the bidding of the wealthy and the powerful to the detriment of the poor and powerless. And the reason I believe that that's really gotten bad, the divide between, I guess what you want to call the parasites and the poor, is that, because you can bid out a job three or four different companies, and so that company is bidding that out multiple times and still getting the benefits of someone else's labor, and everything that's necessary to run a business, cost, overhead and all that, insurance, call it what you will, raw materials and all that gets paid, and then your wage is figured after that. So, that's just, I think that's just, that's just what it is, you really can't, this is where we are. This wealth enables, thus the bourgeois owners of the means of production amass enormous wealth, while the proletariat falls further into poverty. This wealth also enables the bourgeois to control the government or state, which does the bidding of the wealthy and the powerful to the detriment of the poor and the powerless. The exploitation of one class by another remains hidden, however, by a set of ideas that Marx called ideology, the ruling ideas of every epoch. He wrote, in the German ideology are the ideas of the ruling class. By this, Marx meant that the conventional or mainstream ideas taught in classrooms, preached from pulpits, and communicated through the mass media are ideas that serve the interests of the dominant class. In slave societies, for example, slavery was depicted as normal, natural, and just. There's a lot of people advocating for slavery to come back, aren't they? Y'all might want to look at it. In capitalist societies, the free market is portrayed as operating efficiently, fairly, and for the benefit of all, while alternative economic arrangements such as socialism are derided or dismissed as false or fanciful. These ideas serve to justify or legitimize the unequal distribution of economic and political power. Even exploited workers may fail to understand their true interest and accept the dominant ideology, a condition that later Marxists called false consciousness. One One particularly pernicious source of ideological obfuscation is religion, which Marx called the opium of the people, because it purportedly dulls the critical faculties and lead workers to accept their wretched condition as part of God's plan. Wow. This is the one I really wanted to lead, these first three principles, because I was just blown away. I really was. And this guy was, he was around, and he was born early. He received his doctorate in 1841. I believe he was born like in 1818, or so it's been, 200 years ago, so I mean, I was blown away. I really was. It was like, man. I can't even remember where I was at. Okay. Besides inequality, poverty, and false consciousness, capitalism also produces alienation. By this, Marx meant that workers are separated or estranged from the product of their labor, which they do not own, the process of production, which under factory conditions makes them an appendage of the machine. The sense of satisfaction that they would derive from using their human capacities in unique and creative ways, and other human beings whom they see as rivals, competing for jobs and wages. Marx believed that capitalism is a volatile economic system that will suffer a series of ever-worsening crises, recessions, and depressions that will produce greater unemployment, lower wages, and increasing misery among the industrial proletariat. These crises will convince the proletariat that its interests as a class are implacably opposed to those of the ruling bourgeois. Armed with revolutionary class consciousness, the proletariat will seize the major means of production along with the institutions of state power, police, courts, prisons, and so on, and establish a socialist state that Marx called the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. Wow. The proletariat will thus rule in its own class interest, as the bourgeois did before, in order to prevent a counter-revolution by the displaced bourgeois. Once this threat disappears, however, the need for the state will also disappear. There's a lot of religious people calling for the dissolving of the state, aren't they? Thus, the interim state will wither away and be replaced by a classless communist society. But I think today this stuff can go so many different ways by a mathematical equation on a computer that I think we can throw our history down the books. But it's obviously that they've, a lot of the tech gurus and stuff will say that they're Marxist, communist, socialist. Some of them call themselves anarchist. No order at all. But that doesn't. But I mean, does that? I think the one that he's part of Google, and Elon's one of his baby mamas calls herself a. I don't think she uses communist, but I think she does speak in favorable terms toward communism because it says, well, that doesn't give you the collective farm. But I mean, it's wow. I mean, and that doesn't have no bearing on him, but I mean, it's just odd, because usually, if you're gonna, the old saying goes that you are who you hang out with. Most of the time that's right. I don't know the man's heart, so it's not fair. Marx's visions of communists is remarkably and perhaps intentionally vague. Unlike earlier utopian socialists, whom Marx and Engels derided as unscientific and impractical, those three guys, Marx did not produce detailed blueprints for a future society. Some features that he did describe, such as public education and a graduated income tax, are now commonplace. Other features, such as public ownership of the major means of production and distribution of goods and services according to the principle, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, remain as radical as they were in Marx's time. But for the most part, Marx believed that the institutions of a future communist society should be designed and decided democratically by the people living in it. It was not his task, he said, to write recipes for the kitchen of the future. Yet, though Marx was reluctant to write such recipes, many of his followers were not. Among them was his friend and co-author, Friedrich Engels. After Marx's death in 1883, Engels became the chief expositor of Marxist theory, which he simplified and in several respects transformed. His version of Marxism, which he called scientific socialism, made Marxist theory more rigid and deterministic than Marx had intended. Thus, Marx's historical materialism became a variant of philosophical materialism, the doctrine that only physical matter and its motions are real. According to Engels' science of dialectics, everything, nature, you hear that word a lot, history, even human thought, is reducible to matter, moving in accordance with the same timeless iron laws of motion. This emendation of Marxist theory provided the basis for the subsequent development of dialectical materialism in the Soviet Union. And the reason I'm beating Soviet Union to death, and I'll just, I'll say it. I'll show you something here in a minute. There's a reason that, After Engels' death in 1895, Marx followers split into two main camps: revisionist Marxists, who favored a gradual and peaceful transition to socialism, and revolutionary Marxists, among them the leaders of the Communist Russian Revolution of 17. The foremost revisionist was Edward Bernstein, a leader of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, who fled his homeland in 1881 to avoid arrest and imprisonment under the anti-socialist laws of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. And you notice a lot of these guys come from Germany. So let's be fair. I do too, supposedly, but yeah. I mean, if you know the heart of man, as greedy as we are, it just... Bernstein's experiences there, including his association with the Gradualist Fabian Society, led him to conclude that a peaceful parliamentary transition to socialism was possible, a conclusion he defended and extended beyond Britain. Bernstein revised Marxist theory in four interrelated respects. First, he added an ethical dimension that had been largely lacking in Marxist thought. Specifically, he held, following the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, that human beings should be treated as ends in themselves and never as means or instruments. You ever hear the phrase, the end justifies the means? There's a lot of evangelical Christians saying that too. Whether by capitalists who use workers as human machines, and other people on the far left, or by communists who are prepared to use them as cannon fodder in the future revolution. Second, he argued that the emergence of trade unions and working-class political parties in late 19th century Europe presented opportunities that required revisions in Marxist theories, and therefore in Marxian political practice. Third, Bernstein noted that rising wages and better working conditions meant that, contrary to Marx's prediction of the immiseration of the proletariat, the lives of the workers in advanced capitalist countries were actually improving. This trend he traced not to the kindness of capitalists, but to the growing power of unions and working-class political parties. First, however, he also warned of the danger of revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, which was likely to become a dictatorship of club orators and writers. On the basis of these four revisions, then, Bernstein advocated gradual, piecemeal, and peaceful reform, evolutionary socialism, rather than violent proletariat revolution. I mean, you've got people that lay the groundwork, and somebody comes on and says, "I've made it better. I've made it better. I've made it better." Technology's going to, if they had had the technology we have then that we do now, wow. Orthodox Marxists branded Bernstein a bourgeois and counter-revolutionary traitor to the cause. Chief among his communist critics was Lenin, who had devoted his life to the revolutionary transformation of Russia. Russia in the 20th century was an unlikely setting for the proletariat revolution that Marxists predicted. Its economy was primarily agricultural, its factories were few and inefficient, and its industrial proletariat was small. Most Russians were peasants who farmed land owned by wealthy nobles. Russia, in short, was nearer feudalism than capitalism. There was, however, growing discontent in the countryside, and Lenin's Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party saw an opportunity to harness that discontent to overthrow the autocratic czarist regime and replace it with a radically different economic and political system. Lenin was the chief architect of this plan. As head of the revolutionary Bolshevik faction of the party, Lenin made two important changes to the theory and practice of communism as Marx had envisioned it, changes so significant that the party's ideology was later renamed Marxist-Leninism. The first set out in What is to be Done, 1902, was that revolution could not and should not be made spontaneously by the proletariat, and Marx had expected, but had to be made by workers and peasants, led by an elite vanguard party composed of radicalized middle-class intellectuals like himself. Isn't Vanguard the second biggest stock company behind BlackRock? I believe it is. It's always BlackRock or Vanguard. It's always those two. And then there's a third, but I think it's like a kind of a distant third. Secretive, tightly organized, and highly disciplined, the Communist Party would educate, guide, and direct the masses. This was necessary, Lenin claimed, because the masses, suffering from false consciousness, you can't think on your own, and unable to discern their true interest, could not be trusted to govern themselves. Democracy was to be practiced only within the party, and then it was to be constrained by the policies of democratic centralism. That is, full and vigorous debate would lead to a decision that would determine the party's line on an issue, whereupon the party's central leadership would close off debate and require adherence to the party line. And please don't think in terms of right and left. I think that's been blurred. Such strict discipline was necessary, Lenin maintained, if the party was to guide the masses to revolution and establish the socialist worker state that would follow. In short, the revolutionary dictatorship of proletariat had to be dictatorship of the Communist Party in the name of the proletariat. A second and closely related change appears in Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, in which he implied that communist revolution would not begin in advanced capitalist countries such as Germany and Britain, because workers there were imbued with reform-minded trade union consciousness instead of revolutionary class consciousness. This, he argued, was because the most direct and brutal exploitation of workers had shifted to the colonies of imperialist nations such as Britain. The capitalists reaped super profits from the cheap raw materials and labor available in these colonies and were thus able to bribe workers at home with slightly higher wages, a shorter work week, and other reforms. So contrary to Marx's expectation, communist revolution would begin in economically backward countries, such as Russia, and in the oppressed and exploited colonial countries of the capitalist periphery, later to be called the Third World. The Russian Revolution of 17 came in a way that no one, not even Lenin, had predicted. Its immediate impetus was World War I, which has taken a heavy toll on Russian soldiers at the front and on peasants at home. Riots broke out in several Russian cities when Tsar Nicholas ordered soldiers to put them down. They refused. Nicholas abdicated and his government was replaced by one led by Alexander Kerensky, committed to continuing the war against Germany. Kerensky's provisional government was almost as unpopular as the Tsar's. Lenin returned to Russia from exile in Switzerland barely in time to lead the Bolsheviks in seizing state power in October. He then became premier of a new government based on Soviets or Workers' Council. And I believe that Tsar Nicholas, I believe that the way they killed him is they had him and all of his kids. He had quite a few kids. And they, said we're all going to take a picture, and they all gunned him down. And they said that one of the kids was still breathing, and they went up point blank, put a bullet in him. These, bloodthirsty people. The Soviet government moved quickly to withdraw the war in Europe and to nationalize private industry and agriculture. In the name of the people and under the banner of war communism, it seized mine, mills, factories, and the estates of wealthy landowners, which it redistributed to peasants. The landowners and aristocrats, aided by troops and supplies from capitalist countries, including Britain and the United States, mounted a white counter-revolution against the red government. The Russian Civil War ended in 1920 with the victory of the Reds, but the war in Europe and the war at home left the Soviet Union in shambles. Its economic productivity meager and its people hungry and discontented. Desperate for war to maneuver, Lenin in 1921 announced a new economic policy. The Green New Deal? I think that's where the Green New Deal come from, whereby the state retained control of large industries but encouraged individual initiative, private enterprise, and the profit motive among farmers and owners of small business. There's 3 principles that Marx had that I don't think's on this one, but I really wanted because they were like, I know these 3s keep showing up, but let's just go over Stalinism. Lenin's death in 1924 left Joseph Stalin, Trotsky, and Nicholas Bukharin as the leaders of the All-Russian Communist Party. Before he died, Lenin warned his party comrades to beware of Stalin's ambitions. The warning proved prophetic. Ruthless and cunning, Stalin, born Iosif Jugashvili, that's my best attempt at it, seemed intent on living up to his revolutionary surname, which means man of steel. In the late 1920s, Stalin began to consolidate his power by intimidating and discrediting his rivals. In the 1930s, claiming to see spies and saboteurs everywhere. Inside threats, right? He purged the party and the general populace, exiling dissidents to Siberia or summarily executing them after show trials. Bukharin was convicted on trumped-up charges and was executed in 1938. Trotsky, who had fled abroad, was condemned in absentia and was assassinated in Mexico. There's a lot of people that say that Trotsky converted to a Christian before he died. Never give up hope, right? By one of Stalin's agents. Those who remained lived in fear of the NKVD, a forerunner of the KGB, Stalin's secret police. Marxist-Leninism, Stalinism had 3 key features. The first was its reliance on dialectical materialism. I think this is what I was looking for, as a way of justifying almost any course of action that Stalin wished to pursue. For example, in a report to the 16th Congress of the Communist Party in 1930, Stalin justified the rapid growth of centralized state power as follows. We stand for the withering away of the state. At the same time, we stand for the strengthening of the strongest state power that has ever existed. Is this contradictory? Yes, it is contradictory, but this contradiction fully reflects Marx's dialectics. Contradictions all over the place. But Stalin omitted mentioning that Marx believed that contradictions were to be exposed and overcome, not accepted and embraced. A second feature of Stalinism was its cult of personality, whereas Lenin had claimed that the workers suffered from false consciousness and therefore needed a vanguard party to guide them. Stalin maintained that the Communist Party itself suffered from false consciousness and from spies and traitors within its ranks, and therefore needed an all-wise leader, Stalin himself, to guide it. This effectively ended inter-party democracy and democratic centralism. The resulting cult of personality portrayed Stalin as a universal genius in every subject, from linguistics to genetics. A third feature of Stalinism was the idea of socialism in one country. This is one that really got me here. Maybe y'all can look at it, but just listen. Building up the industrial base and military might of the Soviet Union before exporting revolution abroad. To this end, Stalin rescinded the NEP, began the collectivization of Soviet agriculture, and embarked on a national program of rapid, forced industrialization. Specifically, he insisted that the Soviet Union had to be quickly, and if need be brutally, transformed from a primarily agricultural nation to an advanced industrial power. During the collectivization, millions of kulaks, or prosperous peasants, were deprived of their farms. Is there a war on our farmers? Yes, there is. And forced to labor on large collective farms. If they resisted or were even thought likely to do so, they were shot or sent to forced labor camps in Siberia to starve or freeze to death. And the food shortages that resulted, including the famine in Ukraine, Several million people starved, and many more suffered from malnutrition and disease. In foreign policy, socialism in one country meant putting the interests of the Soviet Union ahead of the interests of the international communist movement. After World War II, Winston Churchill famously remarked, "An iron curtain descended across Europe as Stalin installed communist regimes in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, Albania, and Soviet occupied East Germany as a buffer zone against an invasion from Europe." He also subordinated the interests and aspirations of Communist Party there and elsewhere to the interests of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. A few dissident leaders, notably Joseph Broz Tito in Yugoslavia, were rather reluctant allies, but were most pliant, perhaps out of fear of Soviet military might. Beyond Europe, the Soviet Union supported anti-colonial wars of national liberation in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and gave economic and military support to communist regimes in North Korea, North Vietnam, and Cuba. After Stalin's death in 1953, there was a slow liberalization within the CPSU and in Soviet society at large. Though the Cold War with the West continued, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin's crime in a secret speech to the 20th Party in 1956. Khrushchev himself was deposed in 1964, after which a succession of Soviet leaders stifled reform and attempted to impose a modified version of Stalinism. In the 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, began a new liberalization of Soviet society, yet the ghost of Stalin was not exorcised completely until the collapse and the demise of the CPSU in 1991. And I've got a thing on Mao Zedong, but I guess, yeah, I want to do this page. I think this is probably the most important. The People's Republic of China is the only global superpower still ruled by a Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party, as it had been since the Communists came to power in 1949, even so, the official Chinese version of communism, Maoism, or Mao Zedong thought, is a far cry from Marx's original vision. See, they all got their own little, well, it'll work this time, right? The founder of the People's Republic and China's first communist leaders claimed to have creatively amended Marxist theory and communist practice to suit Chinese conditions. Hartke invoked Lenin's theory of imperialism to explain Chinese backwardness and to justify a revolution in a poor agricultural society without the sizable industrial proletariat that Marx believed was generally necessary to instigate a workers' revolution. Second, Mao redefined or replaced key concepts of Marx theory. Most notably, he replaced the Marxist concept of a proletarian class of industrial wage laborers, exploited by the capitalist ruling class with the idea of a proletariat nation of agricultural peasants, exploited by capitalist countries such as the United States. Mao envisioned the proletarian countries encircling the capitalist countries and waging war of national liberation to cut off foreign sources of cheap labor and raw materials, thereby depriving the capitalist countries of the ever-expanding revenues that are the lifeblood of their economies. Mao also planned and oversaw several industrial and agricultural initiatives that proved disastrous for the Chinese people. Among the most important of these was the Great Leap Forward. Everybody's got their own little niche, don't they? His versions of Stalin's policy of rapid forced industrialization, aimed to produce steel and backyard blast furnace and to manufacture other commodities and hastily erected small-scale factories. It was a spectacular failure. As Mao consolidated his power, he became increasingly concerned with ideological purity, favoring ideological dedicated cadres of Reds over technical experts in education, engineering, factory management, and other areas. The Cultural Revolution attempted to enforce ideological orthodoxy, and it too proved disastrous. Young Red Guards attacked bureaucrats, managers, teachers, and others whose ideological purity was suspect. Widespread chaos ensued, and eventually the People's Liberation Army was called in to restore order. Mao also aspired to bring the great helmsman who would lead China out of poverty into a bright communist future. His cult of personality, like Stalin's, portrayed him as larger than life and endowed with unrivaled wisdom as found For example, in the sayings and slogans in his Little Red Book, after Mao's death in 1976, the Chinese Communist leadership began to experiment with limited free reforms in the economy, but continued to keep a tight lid on political dissent. Those policy changes, including the controlled opening of the Chinese economy to foreign investment and the gradual abandonment of collective agriculture in favor of family farming, contributed to China's record economic growth beginning in the 80s. So as you can see, this would be great for a banker, right? Because your bills are going to be paid, even at the barrel of a gun. Although Marx remains the preeminent communist theorist, there have been several varieties of non-Marxist communism. Among the most influential is anarchism or anarcho-communism, which advocates not only communal ownership of property, but also the abolition of the state. Historically important anarcho-communists have included William Godwin in England, Mikhail Bakunin, and Peter Kropotkin in Russia. Those spent much of their lives in exile, and Emma Goldman in the United States. In different ways, they argued that the state and private property are interdependent institutions. The state exists to protect private property, and the owners of private property protect the state. If the property is to be owned communally and distributed equally, the state must be smashed, and for all. In Statism and Anarchy, for example, Bakunin attacked Marx's views that the transitional state, the dictatorship of proletariat, would simply wither away after it served its purpose of preventing a bourgeois counter-revolution. No state, said Bakunin, has ever withered away, and no state ever will. To the contrary, it is in the very nature of the state to extend its control over its subjects, limiting and finally eliminating whatever liberty they once had to control their own lives. Now, I believe that this could be the one thing that could happen, and then we could go under a technocracy, something that is, it's more controlling than you've ever thought. It may not be as bloody, but it's potentially, like I say, potentially. I'm not, Marx's interim state would be in fact a dictatorship of the proletariat. In that respect, at least, Bakunin proved to be a better prophet than Marx. And like I said, I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater in this deal, but I just think we need to be aware because, I don't think, you can hardly trust anything you even see anymore, much less hear. It's just crazy. Despite the difficulties and dislocations wrought by the transition to a capitalist market economy, Russia and the former Soviet republics are unlikely to establish communist rule. Alright, well, I'll go to the next one. I wasn't going to do all this one. Let's break it up. I'll do this first. This I think you should hear. I think I've done small snippets of this in the past, but I think this kind of just, you don't have to take it as gospel, but I think it's important to hear.
Never been an enemy of the Soviet Union. They worked with these communists. The man who started this whole intelligence operation, the OSS, he was recruiting known communists who were involved in the Spanish subverting Spain. There's no more. They're not Americans. They're not Christians. They're German existentialists. Now, what are they doing running our nation? It's kind of, they have more affinity for the state of Israel right now than they do our nation. They don't care about American citizens. The judges now in the courts are military officers following chain of command orders. They're not independent judges.
So all this spills over then into the political areas, like the judgeships.
Sure. They're all Marines.
Senators, congressmen.
Sure. Who is John Warner? A Marine. Who is Chuck Robb? A Marine. They control the powerful committees. Dick Davis, Lieutenant Governor of Virginia. A Marine. His wife was, I hate to say it, well, everybody knows, in Norfolk, a prostitute. You know, Martha was.
I'm sorry, I wouldn't want to put that in there. Like, I just wanted to get the gist of the whole statement. So, in '89, the Ulyanov family moved to Samara, known as Kobayshev. I hope I got that right. From 35 to 91, after much petitioning, Lenin was granted permission to take his law examinations. Wait. Okay, anyway. In November of 91, he passed his examinations, taking a first in all subjects, and was graduated with a first-class degree. After the police finally waived their political objections, Lenin was admitted to the bar and practiced law in Samara in 92-93, his clients being mainly poor peasants and artisans. In his experience practicing law, he acquired an intense loathing for the class bias of the legal system and a lifelong revulsion for lawyers, even those who claimed to be social democrats. And on that, I forgot I was going to... An existentialist is basically a person that they believe in order, but they believe in their own laws, even if that means chopping the head off your enemy, shooting them, or putting them in prison, whatever it takes, right? All they really seem to understand is power. And I think that's a lot of people in our nation. Not all. A lot of people that are power hungry. I think they're hiding. You hear a lot of people that say, well, Jesus said to cut your arm off, and Jesus would have hurt him. Jesus would have probably been defined as a liberal and thrown in jail these days and done the same thing that was done to him then. I mean, I think they're using Jesus to stick their foot in the door. Another gospel, another Jesus, right? Law proved to be an extremely useful cover for a revolutionary. He moved to St. Petersburg in 93, and while working as a public offender associated with revolutionary Marxist circles, in 95 his comrades sent him abroad to make contact with Russian exiles in Western Europe, especially with Russia's most commanding Marxist thinker, Georgy Plekhanov. Upon his return to Russia in 95, Lenin and other Marxists, including L. Martov, the future leader of the Mensheviks, succeeded in unifying the Marxist groups of the capital in an organization known as the Union for the Struggle of the Liberation of the Working Class. The Union issued leaflets and proclamations on the workers' behalf, supported worker strikes, and infiltrated workers to impart them to the rudiments of Marxism. In 95, the leaders of the Union were arrested. Lenin was jailed for 15 months and thereafter was sent into exile to Shushenskoye, Siberia, for a term of 3 years. He was joined there in exile by his fiancée. I'm not even going to attempt that one. Whom he had met in the capital. They were married in Siberia and became Lenin's indispensable secretary and comrade. In exile, they conducted clandestine party correspondence and collaborated on a Russian translation of Sidney and Beatrice Webb. Upon completing his term of Siberian exile in 1900, Lenin left the country and was joined later by Krupskaya in Munich. His first major task abroad was to join Plekhanov, Martov, and 3 other editors in bringing out the newspaper Iskra, which they hoped would unify the Russia's Marxist groups that were scattered throughout Russia and Western Europe into a cohesive social democratic party. I think a lot of this is kind of dry. The Lenin one was really hard to read. I went through all these, like 90% of them, and they're really dry. It's over an hour now. That's just... This one's a little bit better. Kind of went over this too, but okay, let's just go over who Mao was. Alright, he was born December 26, was the principal Chinese Marxist theorist, soldier, and statesman who led his country's communist revolution. Mao was the leader of the CCP from 1935 until his death, and he was chief of state of the People's Republic of China from 1949 to 1959 and chairman of the party until his death. When China emerged from a half-century of revolution as the world's most populous country and launched itself on a path of economic development and social change, Mao Zedong occupied a critical place in the story of the country's resurgence. To be sure, he did not play a dominant role throughout the whole struggle. In the early years of the CCP, he was a secondary figure, though by no means a negligible one, and even after the 40s, except perhaps during the Cultural Revolution, the crucial decisions were not his alone. Nevertheless, looking at the whole period from the foundation of the CCP in 21 to Mao's death in 76, one can fairly regard Mao as the principal architect of the new China. Alright, so I like this. Mao spent 6 months as a soldier, while he probably had not yet clearly grasped the idea that, as he later put it, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. His first brief military experience at least confirmed his boyhood admiration of military leaders and exploits. In primary school days, his heroes had included not only the great war emperors of the Chinese past, but Napoleon I and George Washington. So, pursued by the military governor of Hunan, Mao was soon forced to flee his native province once more, and he returned for another year to an urban environment, Guangzhou, the main power base of the nationalists. However, though he lived in Guangzhou, Mao still focused his attention on the countryside. He became the acting head of the propaganda of the Nationalist Party, in which capacity he edited its leading organ, the political weekly, and attended the second Kuomintang Congress in January 26, but he also served at the Peasant Movement Training Institute set up in Guangzhou under the auspices of the Nationalists. As principal of the 6th training session, Chiang Kai-shek had become the leader of the Nationalists after the death of Sun Yat-sen in March 25, although Chiang still declared his allegiance to the World Revolution and wished to avail himself of aid from the Soviet Union. Well, I don't even know where I'm going to go with it. I think I'm starting to kind of... Where I think I was wanting to head with this is... And like, I'm not trying to throw out... But I just think we just need to just be careful. So like the next thing, I'm not pointing the finger, but you know, all this kind of, it's all very, very similar. I was going to do Adolf. And this...
ones that don't live in our state. So our farmers, who have had this ancestral connection to the land, are now becoming tenants again, something we left Germany in large part for. Just to take a side quest here for a second, I remember when I was doing all of that research in my family to understand a lot about the history and what drove them to leave this homeland of theirs. Because Iowa was made up, 35-40% German immigrants came over. Very industrious people, very family-oriented people, people that had pride in the work that they do.
Objectively, some of the best people ever.
I would say that.
I'm not one of them, but I just have noticed.
Big on tradition, and big on family, and a lot of pride in where they came from. So what would motivate people to leave? And I think the common answer we always heard was, well, it's religious persecution. And so I started to get interested in this just to understand more. What were the real conditions? And I actually found out that my family, a lot of Germans came over around 1850. Well, in 1848 in Germany, there was an attempted revolution.
Across Europe.
Across Europe, yes. And it was called 48ers. And what did they want? They wanted to be able to own the ground under their feet. They wanted free speech. They didn't like slavery. They had a lot of these, now what we call Western ideals.
It was the end of feudalism, right?
Yes, right. And so what happened to them? They were defeated. And so in Germany, when they're defeated, many of them got exiled. And then many others just left. Well, what state came online in 1846 was Iowa. And it was also very agrarian, just like where they came from. And so many people came.
Notice that word, agrarian.
Came over, and I like to talk about this, that, one of the key points in Iowa's history that I'm most proud of is how Iowans responded during the Civil War. So, we had the Missouri Compromise, we had the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and with that decision of, they sort of get to decide whether or not they're going to be free slave, there was a lot of wealthy landowning elites that were rushing to the Midwest to try to lobby to create slave states.
Of course.
And this Iowa
plantations on the prairie.
Right. And Iowa's not a part of this. But one of my favorite stories in 1861, the governor of Iowa, his name was Governor Samuel Kirkwood. He was on his plow in his field when a messenger from the Department of War brought him a message on horseback to him. And in it, the president said he needed to put together a company of 750 troops to be ready in 2 weeks. And mind you, this is 15 years after Iowa came.
I'm not making preconceived notions on the guy. He seems like a nice guy, family man. But is he just front man? And I think he's running for governor. But So let's define agrarianism. His strong roots in Greece and Rome. As early as the 8th century, the Greek poet Hesiod, in his epic works and days, forged a link between moral improvement and farming. In the 3rd and 2nd centuries, the Roman orator Marcus Cato, in his only surviving work De Agricultura, defended the honor of farming, offering moral prescription and wisdom alongside advice on the tilling and managing of land. The Roman poet Virgil's highly praised Georgics, written in the last century and influenced by Hesiod, expresses a love for the countryside and includes instruction in agriculture. The Roman poet Horace, a friend of Virgil and himself the recipient of a farm granted by a benefactor, also praised country life. In his odes, he revisited the hills and woods of his childhood and set forth the rural life as a means to independence and self-reliance. I love that. I think I missed it. I missed it. I'm sorry. But that was probably important too. It says in social and political philosophy, perspective that stresses the primacy of family farming, widespread property ownership, and political decentralization. Agrarian ideas are typically justified in terms of how they serve to cultivate moral character and to develop a full and responsible person. Many proponents of agrarianism revere nature, whether understood as a natural phenomenon or as God's creation, respect tradition and experience, distrust ideology, and regard science and technology with skepticism. Proponents of agrarianism believe that when individuals attach themselves to farming and a rural way of life, the required labor enhances their existence. Family and locale are rooted, allowing stable associations to develop that enable people to experience in a non-acquisitive way the goods of a grounded community, including leisure, friendship, love, art, and religion. I don't have any problem with that. The problem is who defines it, who implements it, and who actually makes it public. Because the problem with these things is they're doing the cart before the horse, basically. And they won't come out and say it because I don't think it's being run by honest people, and I think it's all really front men. And here again, it starts in Germany, right? And I mean, I'll just skip that one. I think I'm ready to wrap this thing up. Oh, there it was. Nah, I'm going to skip that too. Now let's add another word to that word. Agrarian socialism. And I was going to do this in my state, but last time I think that they wasn't too happy about it, so let me bend to their will. And let's talk about agrarian socialism. That's just going to be, let's just talk about it like that, right? Okay. That promotes social ownership of agrarian and agricultural production as opposed to private ownership. So what if like they said, I don't know if he said it in that interview. He said it a few minutes later. He said that a lot of people are using LLCs, which I agree with. He's right, but now we don't know because the technology is just so whack, and there's nothing to rein it in. It's like I said, I'm not beating down anybody in this deal, but it's just like, and I think it's going to be just a few, and I think religions, businesses, and they're going to dictate. You're going to live in the swamp that can't produce anything, and you're going to be, you're going to have a harvest because you're not wanting to go wrong with the program. If it does come into that. Because I know here, I've tried, this will be my 4th year, and I'm going to try it again. But it's like, and I've fertilized it, done everything I can. So, and then if they want to, they just, they do whatever they want to the soil. So you can go somewhere with that it's all going to be this equalism. Let's define what feudalism is. I think we already done it, but yeah, here let's just go to this. I think we already did it, but let me see. I can't remember that far back. Is it designated between economic and political conditions in Europe during the Middle Ages, the long stretch of time between the 5th and 12th century? Feudalism, the related term feudal system, are labels invented long after the period to which they were applied. They refer to those who invented them perceived as the most significant and distinctive characteristics of the early and central Middle Ages. The expressions feodalite and feudal system were coined by the beginning of the 17th century, and the English words feudality and feudalism, as well as feudal pyramid, were in use by the end of the 18th century. They were derived from the Latin words feudum and feodalitas, services connected with the fief, both of which were used during the Middle Ages and later to reform to a form of property holding. Use of the terms associated with feudum to denote the essential characteristics of the early Middle Ages has invested with fief with exaggerated prominence and placed undue emphasis on the importance of a specific mode of land tenure to the detriment of other more significant aspects of social, economic, and political lives. So basically it's like kings and nobles and all that, and then there's, I guess, whoever, and then it's peons, slaves or whatever. Like, that's it, y'all. And I just wanted to be up front and be really just to the point about it. Like, you know, because I mean, we don't know what truth is. I don't think you can throw out anything with technology. You know what I mean? But you know, I think we're going to be, if anything, we're going to be a technocrats with, you know, and we're probably not going to have a defined government. It's going to be local communities, and then, you know, it's like they want to shrink us. It's like, oh, y'all are way out here, and we want to bring that all in, and then here, it's more predictable, it's more management. As you know, these brokers and investors, they don't like unpredictability. You know, they only like that whenever they cause the chaos themselves. But before I leave, the most important part is having a spiritual connection with God and have faith. And that's all I know to tell you is pray. Y'all have a good one.